I think it's great that when we're talking about being abundantly gifted, we have been abundantly gifted food today. But yes, I want to kick it off with a discussion of the verse that I left you with at the end of last week. Exodus 36, 2-3. So I know as you guys are still grabbing things on your plate, I will read this for y'all. And would love to hear some of your thoughts or some of your takeaways meditating on this and what it might mean for us and what it means to use our gifts for God's kingdom. So, and Moses called Bezalel and Aholiab, and every craftsman in whose mind the Lord had put skill, everyone whose heart stirred him up to come do the work. And they received from Moses all the contribution that the people of Israel had brought for doing the work on the sanctuary. And they still kept bringing him free will offerings every morning. Did anyone actually read more of the chapter or look around it, get detailed instructions of a tabernacle? But any thoughts on this passage and scope of our talents, our gifts?
I thought it was really cool how, I was reading the first part, and it said that craftsmen in whose mind the Lord had put the skill.
Yeah.
So the Lord puts those ideas in your mind. This is kind of what I got out of it. Along with it. The Lord puts the ideas already in your mind for those whose hearts were stirred up to come and do the work. So I feel like your heart has to be prepared first. It kind of sounds like to me, and then the Lord will put the thought in your mind, and then you act on it. I just thought that was cool how He's the one who allowed them to do it. It was He who put the thought in their heart, and their mind was already prepared to do the work.
Yeah, or the heart is like that motivation, right? That they want to do it, the desire, right? Like, I don't know if I've always thought of my work and what I do as being like, oh, God gave me this ability, or God gave me the desire to want to do this with people. So it's a different perspective. Any other thoughts? Thanks, Bree.
I thought about my job. I've always thought about the money in the job was already there. And then God gave it to me, so I was able to walk into the job because He gave me the job. So now I have to steward it well. Because He could have gave that job to somebody else. But
Yeah.
It was already there, so it's like a gift. Now He gave it to me, now I have to steward it well.
That's a good way to look at it in our modern times. Here's a job. He gave it to me. How am I going to be a steward of that? And it's a different lens, right? Because there's plenty of people that go over and above for their boss or their team because they feel responsible for the job they're given. But it's different to look at it as, hey, God gave me this. I'm responsible to Him to do work as unto Him. Any other thoughts?
I like how they just kept bringing funds. It's almost like the social media didn't get out. Hey, we don't need any more money. You know, we've hit the thermometer level.
Yeah.
You know, we've colored it all the way in.
The funding goal is complete.
Yeah. Stop bringing it. But even if they keep bringing it, that money can then be it can be moved on to something else.
Yeah.
That can then fund the next goal. So did they not have the vision for the next goal?
Well, I think there's an implication that we might get deeper into on the treasure session next week. But again, if I'm bringing money just to hit a goal, and my sole focus is, did we get enough yet or not? That's a completely different posture in which to bring gifts to the Lord than just, I'm freely bringing. I don't care if you have enough or not. I want a chance to give. So it's kind of a different, when I read that, that's a little bit of what stood out to me. Again, our focus with today is the talent section, the gifts, but it leads nicely into next week's with the treasure of, for a lot of people, or it sounds like with the Israelites, whether they had or not enough, or like there's a section later that they had to go to Moses and be like, stop, we have enough, we don't need any more. But I think it's inspirational to know that the Israelites just kept bringing more and more.
It's good, I had to say it, not as too much. We have too much.
Yeah. What a good problem to have, right? I have too much. And that would be an interesting perspective on our life. I think we often look at how much we have yet to get. I mean, it's good to be goal-oriented, but oftentimes, even professionally, when I coach high producers and high performers, it's like they make so many accomplishments. As soon as they're done, they're looking at the next one. And when do we stop and actually reflect in gratitude and appreciate what we have? What if our perspective was abundance, like we've been talking about the last few classes, where, I'm abundantly gifted. I have enough time. I have enough treasure. Yeah, it's okay to want or set goals to improve yourself, but are those based off of an innate lack or feeling of less than or scarcity or depravity? Or is that out of a desire to better yourself because you feel God's given you so much, you want to make the most out of it? So again, that's a lot of what we'll juggle with today, because there's just different postures in which we can approach life, and I think that's where a lot of the freedom of the gospel comes from, is we can live a life obsessed with the way the world looks at things, the competitive nature, never enough, I want to be the best. It doesn't matter if I have this much, if I don't beat that person over there. And you hear stories of these people that they work their whole life to get something, and once they earn it, it's almost like, what now? Like, I've thought about that, because I studied some media in college, and the Oscars seems like, that'd be so cool. What if you earned an Oscar, or whatever it is, a Grammy or an Emmy? It's like imagining being at the best of your craft and getting up and getting that award and all the sacrifices it would take to get there. And you go home, put it on your shelf, and just have this feeling of like, what's next? People now see me as that level of producer. If I don't come up with good content in my next creative idea, like I was listening to a podcast with some comedians, and they talk about, obviously as a comedian, a big goal is to get your Netflix special or something like that. The moment the special gets out, the moment you get recorded, you can't use a single one of those jokes ever again.
Really? No way.
Because everyone knows it. So you can't go to a comedy club and use your stuff that people can see online. So you almost have to push reset and start over and come up with, I'm just thinking like the pressure of that, where sometimes these things that we glorify and seek after, are they really worth it? And if we shift our posture, it's not that we should avoid those things or not want them, but if we shift the perspective we have about it, maybe we can earn them without the pressure, right? So a lot of today, yes, finding your purpose. You've all been waiting for today's class. I think it's just a profound idea to talk about that. There's no way in an hour and a half, 2 hours, to really discuss this. There's so many directions I wrestled with in preparing for this class of like, how do I cover this topic about what do we do with our talents and our gifts? And if you look at the definition here, thank you, Google, the reason for which something is done or created, for which something exists. So if our purpose as humans, why were we created? Why do we exist? What is the purpose? That's the noun of it. The verb, right? Have as one's intention or objective. So So it's interesting. We were all created for a purpose. God's word tells us that he's an intentional God. He's a creative God. He's a strategic God. He has a plan in the way he's created us. It's hard for us to imagine that he can have 8 billion individual plans, but he's beyond our comprehension. So each of us have a purpose for which we were created, a design. And so we also need to have an intention and an objective for what we're going to do with our lives, right? We have a living out of that purpose. So last week, again, was the worldly resource of our time, right? How are we going to spend our time effectively? What's God's view of time? This week, it's gifts, abilities, talents, skills, work. The primary question you might ask someone you meet as you get to know them is what? What do you do? Our culture foundationally has so much identity wrapped up in this piece. It's a powerful concept. So you might even say, hey, this is my gift to the world, right? The way I've been gifted, my skills, my ability, this is what I give to the world. When we asked the questions in the first class, Angela, you mentioned one's unique contribution to the world. I like that, right? We have this unique contribution, this gift we give. And you gave examples like it could be just being a good listener. I think there's phenomenal things. Like we all have moms and grandmothers and things where it's like, you know, sometimes grandmother just sitting you on your lap. Oh, that's a gift to you as a child. That's a unique contribution that she's making that changes your life, right? Chris, you talked about marketable skills. You know, what am I putting on my LinkedIn, on my resume? Can I develop some skills? Bree, you talked about kind of this worldly versus spiritual perspective, like from the world's, I'm a teacher or I'm a mechanic. Spiritually, there's this lens we look at spiritual gifts too, like prophetic or evangelistic. And although that's more spiritual, I don't know if that's the big takeaway for today either. But how are we going to use these talents? Manisha, I liked how you said, hey, this is my superpower, right? That one gives back to the world, whether it be in the marketplace or the church. This is my superpower. Some are teachable and learned. But what I want to shift our perspective on this concept of purpose is it's not my purpose. It's what's God's purpose for me. Minor change. But my purpose, again, I think we look through this lens of my career or even spiritual gifts, which sounds holy, but sometimes we get so caught up on like, what's my specific gift? And I just need to go do that thing. And I think God's viewpoint is much bigger. I don't think when I talk about what is the purpose you were created, right? What was the vision God had when he knit you together in your mother's womb? And he was just thinking teacher or just thinking lawyer, right? I think it's much broader and more imaginative and powerful. And, you know, this is how we're wired because of our culture and that question of what do you do? And we have a lot of identity in our job, so it's natural to think that God's plan for my life means a job. And I've literally been to different teachings and things amongst the church. I don't think they're necessarily wrong, but as I was debating what direction do I want to go here, my hope is not that today's class you leave and go, oh yes, this is what I should do for my work. No. It may inspire you to shift your perspective and in what your end goal is. But my hope for this class is the way we go about our work shifts in its posture, right? Instead of what's my gift to the world, like the what's my purpose question, why don't we shift to I'm God's gift to the world for his redemptive purpose. So you're the gift, right? God's giving to others, not for my purpose, not for my glory, but for his redemptive purpose. It shifts a lot of what I do and why I do it. I think personally a lot of my stress, anxiety, and work comes from like, this is my gift. And again, we talked about that stewardship versus ownership concept. Like when it's mine and I've got to take the most out of it, I've got to squeeze every ounce of time we talked about last week. If I'm trying to get all I can out of me, if I'm an athlete and I'm trying to get to the limits of what my physical body can achieve. All right, if you're Olympic athletes, if you're, my gym's always playing bodybuilder documentaries. And they're always trying to figure out what's the limit to the amount of muscle that a human body can have. There's so many limitations in our genetics and just our physicality that limit some of those things. But if your obsession, the goal and mission of your life, your gift to the world was, let's see if I can run a faster mile than anyone else, right? That's very different of a lens than God created me as a gift to accomplish his purpose in the world versus how can I use these skills and abilities to gain fame or fortune or recognition for myself. So if we look at this classic verse, Ephesians 2:10, right? We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. So God has a purpose beforehand he created for us. We already know, if we read the Bible, there's a bigger plan here. There's a unified story of the Bible. It leads to Jesus, right? We have the garden. We talked about man and God's space being one. Our sin separating us. Him picking Israel as an example. Let's see if this works. Israel fails. All of the Old Testament points to another way. And then now we have Jesus who creates that way for us to be reunited with God. And there will come a day where there's a new heaven and new earth, and it's one again. We're not living in that day yet, but we can create little pockets of heaven. We can be a part of the journey of God bringing the world back into that with him. So it's funny about my experience with these classes. I always laugh at this because, like last week when I was preparing for the time one, so much of what I was talking about, I was going through because I didn't have enough time. And I was like, stressing about time. This week, I had a similar level of frustration, right? But it felt different. With purpose, it's almost like, am I equipped? Am I covering it the right way? So it's like funny how God's like taken me through this. This is something, if you ever get opportunities to teach, I don't know if any of you guys have that gifting or if you've stepped into that, but that's one of the things that I've found has been beautiful about it is if I'm looking through the lens of God cares about me and my relationship with him, I'm obsessed about my performance. How good was my PowerPoint? Is everyone going to remember, right? Is a video going to turn out good? Are my friends going to listen to it? Like, is George going to listen to this and think, oh, Peter didn't use enough scripture? That's what I'm freaking out about as I'm preparing. And I'm like, oh no, is this the right thing? Did I have a good activity? Are they going to get tired? And God's like, Peter, I'd rather you learn some of this in the process. So I'm going to create situations in your life where it's actually hard for you and your power to use your gifts for what you think they're designed for. And I'm going to create some weakness there, right? Some gap in what you think you need to do to be successful at this and what reality is. And I'm going to allow that space for me to show up and me help coordinate and orchestrate what I have planned for the people in your class, right? So I'm learning it this week, right? Am I doing this for me? And are these results about me? Is this class for me to set myself aside as a teacher? Or am I simply being humbly obedient and faithful to what God has asked me to do? It felt really clear when I was asked to do this class that this is something God had put on my heart. He wanted me to do. I said yes. Part of the earthly wisdom was like, did I have the bandwidth? Was there enough time to do that, Peter? But I don't necessarily have to worry about that in God's economy, because if it's been made clear that he wants to do it, he's going to do it through me, whether if I have enough time to do the amount of prep that I think is necessary for my standards, right? God's going to use it regardless. What'd you say, Manisha?
You could show up and not prep. We'd never know. Like,
Yeah.
we'd probably enjoy and get something out of it. Like,
Yeah.
no doubt.
So again, I'm using that example of my personal experience because this is real, this is raw, right? I could worry about many things, but God's really all I need. And I have to pray, hey, Lord, help me see that in my work today, right? One of my favorite lyrics is from the song called Jireh. It says, I wasn't holding you up, so I could never let you down, right? Like, I'm coming into this class a lot of times thinking, God, you've called me to this. I want to be obedient. I've got to be that good steward and meet the standard, right? But was I holding him up? Did he need me? Similar with what you called out earlier, Chris, like there was more than enough to get God's job done, right? Whether that individual Israelite brought their gift or not, the tabernacle was going to get built. So again, if we're looking at our job as like, I am so significant to the world, that's where our stress comes from. There's this paradigm, right? I want to have a life of significance. I want to have meaning. And when I approach that significance through the worldly lens, that reaps a reward of pressure, anxiety. It's about me and what I do and what I accomplish and what I create for the world. And, you know, you have Elon Musk, that his dying goal is that he's going to make us an interplanetary species. And for him, he's working tirelessly on that mission and for significance, right? It's not that he's a terrible person, but he's seeking significance in a place that's probably leading to a lot of pain and suffering in his life. Versus, we could still accomplish great things. God might accomplish a similar result in our life, but it's coming from a different posture. So part of the thing, another kind of thing I was wrestling with this week is there's an attitude of an entrepreneur versus an employee. I'm an entrepreneur, I run my own business, I work with a team, but as an entrepreneur, a lot of times the weight of a lot of this stuff is on my shoulders, decisions, what I want to do, how I want to do it, making ends meet. Employees, you kind of show up and do my job, and it's not that there's not less pressures, but a lot of what you sacrifice in time and money freedoms as an entrepreneur, you also gain extra responsibility and pressure because it's all on you. There's not a company or a boss in charge. And I think for us, I don't think an employee is a great example of our relationship with God. Absolutely not. Steward is much different, right? It's a child maybe, even better, where he's entrusting us. Hey, do this task. You don't necessarily expect the child to crush it. Kill it out there. Get it perfect for me. You know that they're going to make mistakes. But I think most of us as Americans, in a land of freedom and the American dream, we approach our relationship with God in our modern culture, thank you, through that lens of, if it's going to be, it's up to me. I'm carrying the weight of my reality and my life and my focus. And that's what God was teaching me this week. So I was carrying the weight of this class, and he kept reminding me, let it go, Peter. Let it go. So, yes?
You know what's so interesting to me is like how we could take like this really fun, exciting, thing or opportunity, and it's like you're so stoked about it, but then somehow you like as you get closer, you find yourself in this like turmoil, as you like use the term wrestle. You're wrestling with something. It's like, how do we go from this exciting thing to like all this pressure that you're in, like leading up to
Yeah. Like, remember play when we were kids?
I was just thinking about
You just played.
that. As a kid, we're just so excited, and then as an adult,
And again, it's like, even for me as a coach, it's like sometimes my days, I'm like, I have these one-on-one calls and I'm helping people and I'm like their work therapist, and it's so great. And sometimes I meet people, like this is a specific thing that's happened with actual therapists where I'm like, their job looks so cool. Their only expectation is to show up and run their meetings. Because I'm in a sales role and I'm trying to grow my business, I put all this other pressure. But who's creating that? It's not really the job, it's me, right? And I think for a lot of us, our struggle with our talents, our gifts, our abilities, our job, our purpose, our career, is because we're taking an approach that's worldly and not spiritual. So again, as a quick review, we're talking about whose kingdom, right? Whose authority am I under? Am I under my own authority, my decisions? I'm the king. Or am I an apprentice under Jesus? Am I following another king? Am I living in the world or God's kingdom? Our space, the world of sin and death, the present age, heaven, eternal life, the kingdom of God. And again, this isn't just separated by time when I'm going to die and hopefully go to heaven one day. These overlap here and now. It's not fully overlapping. We're excited for that day. But how can I live in this kingdom? Because we look out at a physical world and we look through that lens. But often, our enemies aren't flesh and blood. But there's the spiritual piece in there. And spiritually, you'll meet people, you can't tell it physically, but they're living in God's kingdom. They're going about doing the same things you are every day, but their whole realm and reality is like a different dimension because they're living in God's kingdom. So, again, we're designed, our whole mission here, we want to experience the abundant life. And that's not based on your goals, your abilities, your skills to go out and create that for yourself. It's Jesus is the source, right? Jesus came to give us life. And it's through our relationship with him that we can have that abundance. Obviously, last week we talked about the timepiece and how the more I try to grip time, the more it slips through my fingers. And God literally hands us on a platter in the Bible, spending time in Leviticus like we did last week. Hey, check it out. Here are some rhythms, some processes that will actually bring you life and fulfillment and abundance. I had the most interesting explanation of a schedule. I talk about schedules all the time for work, but I was listening to this podcast about Brian Johnson, if you've heard this name. He's this millionaire that's trying to reverse aging. If you ever heard of this guy. There's a lot of memes about him, but he's doing these crazy things. He basically has hired a bunch of doctors to help him do all these things to reverse aging. And if you look at his schedule, it's so intense. You know, when he wakes up, when he eats, exactly, he has like down to the minute, right? It's crazy. So this podcast, the interviewer was asking him, like, I've read your schedule. That sounds terrible, right? And then he explained, he's like, you know what? I used to have to think about what I was supposed to do next. I'd wrestle all day with what am I going to do right now? And what's freeing about having a schedule, a rhythm, is that you just kind of execute, you follow it. And he talked about, again, not saying we should all have as strict schedules as him, but it was really authentic to hear someone that's probably got the most strict schedule of anyone I've ever heard of saying, my life is more full because it allows me more present and I feel better. And again, he is, in a worldly wisdom way, taking our science to see what's going to make my body operate at its optimum. And he's loving life because of it. And I think as Christians, we can look at the Bible, and again, he created these feasts and everything for the Israelites because he wanted to create a rhythm in their life that would help create a result of trust. Right? We talked about the Sabbath. If I have to cease from my labor, if I'm trying to claw my way to success or claw my way to put food on the table, and God tells me to stop, and I feel helpless and stranded and I'm out of control, right? But what he's really trying to do is tell me to say, Peter, trust me. You're taking matters into your own hands. I just want you to rest for a day every single week. You don't have to go 24/7. There's more than enough. We will never know how much there is until we stop and let him provide for us. So that was a lot of last week. And again, I won't spend too much time on all these themes. We've already talked about a bunch of these today. Obviously, a lot is going to be purpose and identity, ownership versus stewardship. Yep.
So when we're talking about like rhythms and time,
Yeah.
I was trying to think a little bit about last week about that. And so some of the rhythms, like when you watch Jesus, some of the rhythms he did was like he would pray, or he'd have solitude, or he would fast. So like I felt like, oh, we probably should partake in a lot of those rhythms too.
Yeah. And there was only so much time last week, but if you look at, again, the examples I gave out of Leviticus were specific commandments for the feasts and festivals of the Israelites. Those aren't necessarily for us. We're not celebrating those today, but if you look at a lot of the New Testament type of things, you have stuff like fasting. You have what we call spiritual disciplines. Some call them, I've heard it called a rule of life, kind of these, and rules we have a lot of, rules not the best word, but it's kind of like the structure that allows us to flourish. And that podcast I talked about talks a lot about it. If you actually go and listen to Fight, Hustle, and Hurry, it'll talk about those kind of rhythms. I got to teach a class for Impact on the spiritual disciplines, but solitude is another discipline. That's hard for us. Silence, you forget how noisy things are everywhere. And it's like when we can't barely go to the bathroom and not like, wait, I almost forgot my phone,
Yeah.
you know, and we just inundated with noise and stuff, right? Like that's the worldly way that we live our life. I remember visiting a friend. I was going for a wedding, and I was staying at a buddy's house in Florida, and he nonstop had to have something. And since we were like, I was sharing a room, you know, I was crashing in his dorm. He's like going to bed listening to podcasts. And you know, it's like, it's cool that he's so focused on growth that he's like, I've got to be learning. But I was like, this is intense. Like, can I ever not have some noise? And some people, they have the TV on all the time. And it's just like we get so inundated that when are we going to hear God's voice in all of this? So, yes, I could teach a whole class, a whole series of classes on spiritual disciplines, but you're right, Bree. When you talk about rhythms, model them on the life of Jesus. A lot of our spiritual disciplines, what we see Christians have practiced for millennia, is what were things we saw Jesus doing? Getting up early before light. I mean, we don't always have to get up before the sun comes up, but he would protect time to go out. Because back then, if you think about it, people got up with the sun. So for him to get up before the sun meant I have this protected, sacred, solitude, silent time when not everyone else is around. My disciples and people are needing me, right? So, anywho, for today, and the big thing that we can see in the life of Jesus is Jesus was not hurried, right? That was one thing we've noticed. He was never hurried. He was busy. He was on a mission. He accomplished a lot in his short life. But I don't think he was ever hurried. He was never this urgency, this restlessness. I think that's a lot of how we might define the earthly time versus heavenly time of peace and rest and Sabbath every week. And festivals that he was like, don't do any ordinary work. Celebrate. feast, blow a trumpet. You know, it's like all this awesome stuff that God's trying to give us as a gift. So a lot of that energy, that feeling is going to translate over into what we talk about today with gifts and talents and abilities. So to kick us off, I do want to have an activity. There's 4 of us, so partner off, right? And I just want you to talk about, let's start with the traditional worldly question, right? Or maybe we could just do this in a group setting. There's a small enough group. We can just share, what do you do, right? We can start with Bree, and then we'll go counterclockwise today. But yeah, if you were answering that traditional question, don't overthink it. What do you do?
I'm a mom and I'm a teacher.
I love that. You add the mom in there. Mom and PE teacher.
And wife.
And wife. Chris?
I'm a senior manager of strategic sourcing, category manager for a food production company that produces nutrition bars and protein powders.
LinkedIn. No, just
I
kidding.
know, right? You said that, like,
Yes.
And
Great.
And then they ask, oh, really? Like, what's that? And I was like, and then I would be like, well, I manage contracts for things like nuts and seeds, plant proteins, collagen and gelatins, grain cereals and inclusions, flexible packaging pallets, you know.
Got it down.
right?
And they're like, wow.
He helps us make food,
Yes.
right? I love that. Thanks, Chris. Angela, what do you do?
I manage an animal hospital.
An animal hospital.
So typically what I would say that entails is, well, I manage, but I'm like an animal nurse.
Huh.
I'm in the medical field with animals. And I love it. I've done it for 18 years.
Primarily domesticated? Okay.
That's a good question.
Absolutely.
And not large animals. Small.
I mean, probably the largest would be like a 150-pound dog because they
That's a big job.
exist.
Yeah.
Massive.
I've seen them. They've tried to eat me. I went door to door for 8 summers. I have lots of interactions with dogs. Manisha?
I am in business development for a credit union. So
Business
I
development for
help
credit
grow
union.
the credit union and make money for credit union.
Awesome. I help people reach their goals, right? But yeah, there's lots of ways you could explain what you do. And it's fun how we saw a variety here, right? From Chris's detail to, you know, sometimes I always I'll say coach, and I've literally been like, people are like, oh, what sport? And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I need to clarify that. It's not obvious that I work with business people and entrepreneurs. So with that, the next question to take it a step up is like, okay, what's my purpose? What do we think our purpose is, or what we're here to accomplish? And again, hey, don't overthink this. You're not graded on this. From the lens of today, what's your best stab at that question? What's a shot? I think for this, I'll just let whoever wants to go first try that one. We're all going to share. But what's a purpose that you have?
To glorify God and help people find and follow Jesus.
I love that. Glorify God and help people find and follow Jesus. Thanks, Chris.
I would say to help women find, basically like the best that God has put inside of them, to help activate that and apply it like to their life.
Help women find the best that God has put in for them. Help them activate that and apply it. Thanks, Manisha. Bree, Angel?
I feel like mine's discipleship,
Discipleship.
baptize all the, the Great Commission, is to make disciples that make disciples.
Make disciples.
And another part of my purpose is something with my husband. I know he has a calling to go back to Uganda and build community and church and over there. And it's the support
Yeah.
But support him in what God is calling him to do as well.
Yeah.
Like disciples and just support
Mm.
people. So I think supporting people in their giftings and callings and let them to see what it is to.
I like that. Supporting people in their gifting and callings.
And also, like, feel like sometimes like healing, like process of healing, because I feel like God gives me eyes to see like
Mm.
people's pains.
Yeah.
And so like it's hard to sometimes know how and when to approach that, but to help people walk through like their pain and
Yeah.
into their purpose.
Mm.
So
Thank you. Angela?
To be available for God to work in and through me.
And I like the diversity here too, right? Chris had a really good, kind of clear, very applicable. I remember the blank check degrees in college, right? You could apply that degree to any kind of thing. The way you explain that, hey, you could do a lot of things in that. Manisha, you talked specifically about women. There's, God put a desire in their heart to help. God's put something in you that's like, hey, there's something about helping women that there's a passion, a desire there for you. Bree, what I liked with yours, right? You actually were like, hey, there's something I've noticed about myself that I see this in others, and I want to heal it, right? You're starting to incorporate, here's some specifics of who God created me to be and some things I've noticed over my lifetime that are unique. And I feel that that's a gift God can use in me for the world. And Angela, and yours is just being available and the in me and through me type of. I did a whole exercise at our last conference about making your purpose statement. So I'm just going to read that one. But I put this together. The purpose of my life is to use my faithful loyalty and steadfast compassion to root myself deeply in the truth of God, to guide others to flourish into the fullness of who they were created to be. And I added another section, introducing others to the limitless love and strength they have access to through a relationship with Jesus. So there's a lot of ways we can define our purpose. We can get nitty-gritty. I could do a whole conference or a class, like I did, to put that together. There was a series of steps and questions, and they led the whole room in this exercise. Again, is that going to change my life that I have this written? Maybe, maybe not. But again, this gets a little bit deeper than what do. You see the difference in, wow, it's kind of interesting to hear the individuals in this room, what they do, compared to what they think their purpose is. Now, who's someone you look up to? This could be living, dead, someone maybe you read. Don't use Jesus. Yes, don't use the apostles, the Bible. Hey, maybe if you have a good reason. But, hey, someone throw out somebody that you look up to.
Somebody like Francis Chan.
Yeah. Francis Chan. Why?
Because he used to be part of this megachurch, and then he left that megachurch so that he could be able to fulfill his purpose in helping people to understand really what is this crazy love of God coming to die for us is all about. And he didn't, he discovered that you don't need money. Like, sure, money's great, but you don't need it. So he basically packed up his stuff, went to Hong Kong and hung out there and, helped people to discover Jesus.
I love that.
Recently came back.
Yeah.
So,
Letters to the Church. I like that book that he wrote in kind of that season.
yeah.
Awesome. Who else? Someone you admire?
I really
Manisha?
admire
E.T., yeah. I know we were joking last time, but Eric Thomas, for those that don't know, it's not E.T. Call Home.
It's
It's
not easy.
it's Eric Thomas.
Who's the
Oh, he's a pastor, motivational speaker, and that's basically his profile. It's just
Yeah.
a motivational speaker.
Don't they call him like the hip hop pastor or something like that? Hip hop preacher, yeah.
I,
Why?
It's crazy because I literally, every morning when I go to the gym, I'm listening to, his clips and stuff every single day. I really like the balance biblical principles in a practical way. Then I also feel like he also has this beautiful mixture of like not secular world but marketplace world and like Christian world. I feel like it's a beautiful blend. I don't know, I feel like when he preaches it's just very clear,
Yeah.
easy to follow. And I just feel like he, at least from what I see, it seems like he's the fruit of what he preaches about. And then very lastly, I admire his ability to like triumph,
Mm.
to like come back from adversity and like
Resilience,
yeah.
overcoming.
yeah.
Yeah.
And that's a huge thing that he talks about often.
Yeah.
What's his name?
Eric Thomas.
Eric Thomas.
I like how.
He's like very, he reminds me of my dad. That's another one.
Oh yeah.
Like he talks very like passionately and like,
Oh,
straight.
I listen to Eric Thomas's stuff. If you haven't noticed already, my natural is the cool, soothing, calming. People listen to my podcast. They're like, Peter, I could listen to you and relax and go to bed. And I'm like, I don't want to be your bedtime noise, right? Like, they're like, no, I mean it in a good way. Like, your voice is so soothing. Then Eric Thomas is like wah. And it's like, so sometimes I'll listen to that and be like, I need to get some of that. I'm never going to be like that type of speaker, but I always try to gain, I admire that as well. But I think what's interesting, what we'll get into further in today's class is I like how you made this correction of not secular, but marketplace. Because some reason, as Christians, we kind of have created this divide in like, oh, here's my church life, and we seclude all of the things around church to maybe my 15 minutes in the morning that I read, my midweek something, whether it's like a Bible study or like some kind of thing, and my Sunday. This is my Christian life. And then the rest, I'm out in the world, in secular world. And we have this divide, and we forget that it's all in one thing, right? And we can be Christ in all of these aspects. So, thank you. Others, someone you admire.
Recently I've been reading, like not super recently, but Dr. Rob Reimer, he writes.
Rob
Reimer.
Reimer.
He wrote the book Soul Care and River Dwellers.
Soul Claire.
Yeah, and the book is really good because it just kind of like touches on things that like I feel God has created me to do.
Ah,
And so it just helps me to see like what he's doing and how he does it. And so, and it's a lot of like inner healing. Like
Inner healing,
stuff, yeah. So I really like his books. And again, it's like applicable. Like you read it and it's applicable. I feel like when I read it, it really transformed my life.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I'll read it with other people as well.
very applicable, something that aligns with what you feel your calling is and what you're wanting to do. Love that, Bree. Angela? Oprah. Why?
I grew up with her.
Ah.
I grew up with her. I love her spirit, her student-like energy, but also she's a leader.
Yeah.
She brings people together.
Yeah.
She seems loving and she loves relationships. She's like the aunt I never had.
And I'm grateful that we had like a not directly Christian type example, because I was hoping we'd get a mix, right? And it's that question of why is the important piece. And the other question I want to take, kind of the last one with this, is what's an example, and I don't think everyone will share, I might get one or two if you guys have a good one, but what's an example of a life that seemed really meaningful? Jesus. Yeah, I mean, you'll hear pastors give these illustrations about some missionary, but like, what's a life that seemed like, oh, that was a meaningful life. That person did something amazing.
I feel like it was crazy because I went to 2 funerals, more
Wow.
than 2, but there was one where there was like literally me and like 3 other people.
Mm.
And every person who went up and spoke about them talked about how he changed their lives.
Wow.
The relationship with them, that seemed like a meaningful life to me.
That's a very personal example. A real funeral you went to of a pastor and seeing how people shared about them. Wow. Any others?
I think like someone who lives like a life of intentionality is like lives a life of meaning, because I think, and obviously the intention of like creating relationships and sharing your gifts with others, and like, but being intentional about all of those things. Because I do feel like I have been to several funerals as well, and it's interesting to see the contrast of like people who lived a certain lifestyle and then those who didn't, you know, even down to like when people get up and talk about them, the
Yeah.
things they have to say about them differs.
Very different, yeah.
Mhm.
It's kind of awkward when you go to one where it's like you could tell
I know.
people are trying really hard to make them sound appreciated. But I like how we've gotten some of these. You know, I've heard wild stories about different missionaries and things where you're just like, wow, that's an inspirational life. I met this family when I was going door to door in Wisconsin, and the husband was a doctor, and the mom, I think they raised 6 some kids of their own, and then maybe had 20 some foster kids through the years. And they were at a season in their life where they were adopting terminal children. And the girl they had at that point, I was showing these kids' books, and she asked me if they had soy ink, because she was so allergic to soy that if she read a book with soy ink, this girl would be sick for a week. And not only that, they adopted her from a family somewhere in Central or South America. And I found out later, they moved that family next door to them. So that family, they moved to America, and they had to leave Wisconsin every winter because this child could not survive Wisconsin winters. So imagine the purpose and the meaning behind a life of like, I'm going to adopt a child, incredible personal expense, and watch them slowly die because they're already terminal. They will not live to adulthood. And that was what it sounded like, had done multiple times. Whoa! Right? So you hear these stories of different people, and we look at these lenses. Hey, were those lives, these people we admire, specifically because of what they accomplished for the kingdom or the impact they had on God's kingdom? Was it through a different lens? I don't think any of these things are right or wrong. There's great reasons to admire lots of people and model some of our habits off of them. But if I'm trying to reflect on my meaning and purpose in life, and what's a reflection of when I get to my funeral, and what I'm going to feel like I was a good and faithful servant of the Lord, do I really need to gain the level of success that Oprah did? Phenomenal. She's opened the doors for so many people. She fought a lot of issues in her life. Or can I live a simple life, like if you've heard of Brother Lawrence and Practicing the Presence of God? It's a pretty popular book, but he didn't actually write it, and most of his life he struggled with sickness and all these things long before he became a monk. He's got an interesting backstory before the book. I heard about the book, I read the book, that was cool, but he had a lot of suffering in his life, and he's had an enormous impact because of a book, but I think even in who he was while he was alive had an incredible impact. So sometimes we don't actually understand the meaning and purpose of our own lives, and we're so focused on what we think our meaning and purpose needs to be to gratify our own desires that we're feeling insecure and underconfident and purposeless when God's like, check out what you're doing in the life of these people around you. And we're completely blind to that sometimes. So kind of the core of today is there's kind of these 2 paths that we can choose. And it's not the spiritual path and the secular path of my career. Because to be honest, if I'm looking at my history, a lot of the motivation of this class actually came out of that. Because 3rd generation missionary kid, grandparents on both sides for pretty much 40 years, parents their whole careers overseas. I was raised where people are like, oh, are you going to be a missionary? And it was just like a normal question. I didn't even know how to respond really as a kid. And I've wrestled with that. And as a kid, I remember going and we'd come to America and there'd be these families that would host us. And they were successful business people and they had these big homes. And, you know, it's not that they had a spare bedroom. They had spare bedrooms for each of our family members to stay in. And I remember as a kid not being able to grasp, oh, these are Christians too, right? Like, because in my mind, I didn't really understand how to serve the Lord without like my lens was like, oh, serving God means be a missionary. You leave everything, go overseas, and you serve people the way my parents did. But coming from that type of experience in life to people that were living in what seemed like opulence, right? And from that perspective, I was like, oh, this feels like a life for them. That's shifted a lot now as an adult, and it's not as black and white, but as a kid, it was almost like, oh, if I make money and I'm successful, that's selfish and that's for me. And in order to serve God, I have to work for the church. And I think a lot of people within church communities, they're still stuck in this kind of choices, and they're battling because they have some desires of like, I want to achieve this, and God's put this, like we read in that scripture, God put a desire. And again, there's plenty of ways that we pursue that from the wrong intention, right? From the wrong posture for me and my significance and fame and fortune. But it's not bad to be successful. Like I remember when I was studying film, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I had a chance to interview Ralph Winter at Sundance Film Festival. He was the producer of those original X-Men movies, you know, and Hugh Jackman was Wolverine. And he's a Christian. And I remember asking him about Christian movies, because at that time in my life, I was like debating, like, do I want to get into film? You know, do I want to be a part of making a movie that has a sex scene in it? What would I feel? You know, like, there was all this stuff. And I asked him, like, his thoughts on Christian films. And he's like, you know, we don't need more Christian films. We need more Christians in the film world. He's like, don't worry so much about making a Christian movie. Make good movies. And you be the light in a very dark industry. And it shifted my paradigm, because in my mind, my lens was like, oh, if I want to be a Christian filmmaker, I better make something like The Chosen or something like Jesus Revolution. Like, that's my option, Christian filmmaker. But one of the main writers of that 70s show was a Christian. Hard to believe with the type of content on that 70s show. But again, that's a paradigm, right? If I'm going to be a musician, do I have to be a Christian music artist? Can I create secular music? Is that bad? And I think we wrestle with these. It's easier to look at in those categories, but even in our worlds, I know, like, there's been times in my life that I thought, oh, if I worked for a church, I would feel like, yeah, I'm checking the boxes for God. You know, I'm doing the right thing, right? And I might be doing that out of the wrong motives. I might be terrible at that job. The church might be wasting their money paying for me as a staff member. And it's not doing any good for God's kingdom. And I could be way more productive in something God has specifically equipped me to be a redemptive tool in His vision for the world. So, there are these paths, right? I think a lot of times we miss that 99% of walking with the Lord is the daily relationship with Him. We look through the lens of what did I do for God? And then we look at the lens of what did God do for me? And I don't think that's even what we're supposed to be talking about, right? It's a relationship. Who cares about your job? That's a worldly point of view. God cares about your heart. He cares about how did you interact with the people around you, right? He's caring about you sanctifying into the image of Jesus, not did you accomplish some great feat, and you scored a touchdown and pointed up and put John 3:16 on your, like those are things, hey, nothing against those, but I don't think it's about that, because who's the giver of the gifts? Right? Did we decide where we were born? And why are you good at what you're good at? You ever thought of that? Like, sometimes, like, I have had to wrestle, and this is humbling, but I realize a lot of things that I take pride in have nothing to do with my personal choices. I had the parents that I had that raised me a certain way. I interacted with certain mentors. You ever think about the mentors that have changed your life, the teachers? That's entirely random. Like, how come you went to second grade class with Mrs. Such and Such, who inspired you to become an artist? Did that have anything to do with your own, oh, I'm so great, look at what I've done for my life? No, right? If you start seeing all the ways, it's not random again. There's a plan, there's a strategy, there's a God, there's a creator, there's an engineer behind all of it. But if I'm start looking at what have I done for the world, who have I become? I'm a self-made millionaire, right? That whole concept of self-made is the antithesis of what we see in God's kingdom, right? It's about relationship. We have a eternally relational God, three-in-one God. And to pride myself in being self-made is so different. So again, the more we reflect on, why am I good at that? Why do I like that? Why do I want to do something with women? Why do I care so much about healing? Does that have anything to do with you, Bree? Is that anything on your own choices and decisions? No. Like, God is the giver, right? Here's a nice Spurgeon quote. Whatever be thy position and whatever be thy gifts, remember that they are not thine, and they are lent thee from on high. No man hath any on his own except his sins. Ugh. And God raises us up and he puts us down. Look at Joseph. Look at Moses. You realize Moses had 40 years. He had the 40 years in Egypt. He had 40 years as a shepherd, right? From our worldly context nowadays, like, well, I was just wasting his time in the wilderness, caring for sheep. And then we're like, cool, the last 40 years of Moses' life, that's awesome. He's serving the Lord there. Really? Right? Was the other 80 years of his life worthless? I don't know. Joseph, right? Like, sold into slavery. What do we see at the very end of Genesis? What you meant for evil, God has used for good. God literally orchestrated this thing, not only to save a lot of Egyptians, but to save his people. And we look at Pharaoh himself. Exodus 9, 16 and 17. But for this purpose I have raised you up, he's talking to Pharaoh, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You are still exalting yourself against my people and will not let them go. Right? It's like Pharaoh himself. Pharaohs were considered deities, God-men. That's why they built those pyramids. Like, God literally, in his word, it's like, I did this so that I could show my power. Right? The whole reason Pharaoh was put in that position, which is a very tragic thing if you look at his story. It's like, God's like, hey, I know you're enjoying life and being exalted and having every pleasure that your heart could desire. I did that just to tear you down and show how powerful I am. Right? Like, that's literally what God's doing with Pharaoh. Do I want my life to be that example to others because I worked so hard to build my kingdom that I ended up serving a purpose of showing God's power through my own destruction, right? No, right? He elevates for his purposes, and if we exalt ourselves, it leads to our downfall. Right? Whatever position you are in, ask yourself why God has raised me up to this. Because here's the other question. You might think, oh, I'm in a lowly position. My job is not that exciting or powerful. My income level. In what scope? San Diego? Yeah, maybe. In the world? Like, do you know how elevated each and every one of you are in the lens of the world? Just the freedoms to make the decisions you have. We do have plenty of slavery, and it's tragic. But there's plenty of people that don't have the freedoms just because they didn't have the opportunity. They couldn't even go to school. Think about people that didn't even have the choice to go to school. Can you even be educated? Could you do anything to change your position? No, there's plenty of those people out there, millions of them. And why did God elevate you? What purpose does he have for you? So we have these two paths, right? There's a following God and a follow me God. Right? A lot of us are, here's my life, here's my plan, here's my purpose. Hey God, bless me. Follow me over here. Why is this business opportunity not working out? Lord, this is so difficult. Why are you persecuting me? And right? Are we centering our lives around what we think our mission is and then trying to fit God? Same as our time last week, right? Am I planning my week for all of my delights and my activities? And, you know, cities like San Diego are like adult playgrounds. We can have so much fun in San Diego. And am I planning all of this out and hoping I can squeeze in some quiet time and God be in there a little bit? Or am I planning a Sabbath and saying, no, I'm going to be completely contrary. My friends are going to think I'm weird. And I'm going to plan my life around God. And that's a similar thing with our purpose. And there's two paths. One leads to life, one to death. Matthew 7:13 and 14, right? Enter by the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction. There are many who go in by it. But narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way that leads to life, and there are few that find it. And again, it's not as obvious as we might think, like, oh, the narrow way is working for a church and becoming a pastor. The wide way is making money. No, you can make money. There are plenty of wealthy Abraham was. Lydia, the dealer of purple cloths that helped start an early church and host Paul. Like, there's plenty of room for that in God's kingdom. But what's the purpose? Is this my business that I'm going to fit God into? Or am I actually following God, right? One is a setting my plans and saying, bless me. The second is answering Jesus' radical call to follow me. And we see this from the very beginning. Adam and Eve, right? They had a choice. The fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And it basically represents this choice that all of us make. Am I going to define good and evil for myself and choose my way and make my decisions? Or am I going to trust that there is truth? It's not my truth, it's God's truth. And he's the creator. He gets to define what's good or evil. Yeah?
Why do you call it a radical call?
A radical call?
Yeah, what makes you use that?
I mean, a radical is just, I should look up the definition of radical, really, but from my understanding, it's just different. You know, it's like, again, if we just talk about the Sabbath, that's weird stuff, y'all, right? If we talk about just tithing and giving, like this, one of my favorite illustrations about, we might talk about this next week, but what's the name of the pastor? I can't remember. I'll think of it. But he talked about imagining being an Israelite child and being raised up to take care of your family's business. And every time this new cow had a baby or a new lamb, the father goes, here, bring us that baby. And you bring it, and then he goes, shh, sacrifices it to the Lord, and being the son and being like, Dad, I think we could probably make a whole lot more money here in this business if you stopped killing off all the firstborns, right? Like, that's so weird, so contrary. And again, we're not sacrificing animals anymore in the way that God calls us to follow him now, but there's a lot of ways of like how we spend our money and how we choose to spend our time. Like, I've even had issues where like I have a literal person in my life God puts there. I don't want to spend time with them. I don't. And there's this calling in my heart of like, Peter, go. And I invite them over, I hang out with them. And it's beautiful. God rewards it. But from the lens of the world, it's like, what was in it for you, Peter? Why don't you spend around time with people that are going to add value to your life, that are going to help you reach your goals? Being with the lost, helping the widow, helping the foreigner, helping the poor, the needy, the orphan, that doesn't make sense. I mean, it's cool and popular now to give money to the poor, but then it's like, let me post on Instagram about, let me put my name on that building. But again, that's why I say radical. It's like, it is very different. Yeah. And the way that you approach a career following God is different than how you approach a career asking God to bless you in your plan.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Like, I'm just really curious, and you don't have to share this now or if you don't want to, but I was curious how you got from, because that whole thing, being a missionary and being like generational missionary,
Yeah.
and doing the coaching, like how that transfer, how did you like struggle through that and become like who you are and doing what you're doing now? Do you know what I mean? How,
Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to answer it now if you don't want to, but I just,
Well, no, I mean, it's just like, when I was a kid, I never felt called to missions. So when people would ask me, I was like, I don't know. And then it wasn't until I took a year off of work and went to Impact. And that was a funny journey too, because I felt called to Impact. And I couldn't go right then and there because I had to finish my job. That didn't end for a few months. And then when I finished it, I had the money to buy a new car. I had residual income that was coming in each month. I could have joined Impact. It would have been great. But you know what I thought? I said, Peter, are you going to take a year off of developing your career? And Impact had a night class. Why don't you go work with your brother in his business and build that up and then take the night class? If you could do both, why wouldn't you do both? And I remember someone telling me, one of my mentors at the time, what if all you did was Impact and you could fully focus on the Lord? And I was like, and give up my career for a year? I'm going to be behind. I've got to work. I've got to get out of school debt. And what happened is I failed at that business, and I spent all the money. My car had 240,000 miles, so I had no car, I had no money, and I had to actually trust God to provide for me to go to Impact. And it wasn't until Impact that God goes, you haven't actually ever done anything with your parents. A lot of people growing up as pastors' kids, they were like working in the church and stuff. My parents didn't like use me as slave labor to help out, so I'd never done ministry. Like I might have mentioned before, when I was in college, and my father, he said, find a church family where you can serve and be a part of a family. And I was like, why would I volunteer my time? So again, I had this concept, and so I go to Impact, and I go on these missions trips. I'm like, I want to help my parents. And my attitude at the time was, let me go for my summer break before I start a job, maybe 2 months, and I'll help them out. And I tell my dad that, and he goes, Peter, if you want to have any kind of impact out here, come for at least 6 months. I was like, Dad, you don't understand. I have a crush on this girl in my class, and if I finish Impact and I can't pursue her, maybe she's going to find someone else. I didn't tell this to my dad, but that's where my head was at. And I said yes, and then the more he told me about this role, he was like, hey, come be the chaplain, do our chapel services, teach. And I learned about that role. I was like, I can't go for 6 months and just quit on the kids and leave. So again, it's like little by little, God's actually getting me out there. And what was funny about it was right at the end, I knew I wasn't going to stay. I didn't have the resources. If I wanted to stay, I'd have to come back and fundraise to go back out. And one of the people I was discipling out there goes, what am I going to do when you leave? You've had such an impact on my faith. And they had a story where they had a big mentor in their life that went to a different church and their faith kind of dropped. And I think God did this more for me too than just for them. But I was able to sit down and say, I did not want to come here. Right? I was doing everything I could to serve my own mission and my career. And God took me out of that and put me here. So God has brought me here for this season to have this impact on your life. If he's brought me here out of my mess, he's going to stay with you when I'm gone. And that was a big breakthrough for me, who likes to put his cape on and think I'm the one saving the world, to realize that I'm not the one. Because literally when I was out there in the mission field, I kept saying yes to stuff. And my dad was like, Peter, you're volunteering at things every single night. There's only so much. Say no. And I'm like, Dad, I only have a few months left. I want to leave it all on the field. And he's like, basically what he said in a different way was like how Jesus said, you will always have the poor. Is like, there will be a limitless need and you can't meet it. And I finally had to say, okay. So then I came back, wrestled with re-entry depression, struggled with what to do with my rest of my life, and fell into this career where it was actually a real struggle. And I saw that, hey, this aligns with a lot of my gifts. And what was wild is a few years later, I was asked to potentially be part of staff on this church. And I was a different viewpoint where I was like, my job gives me the flexibility where I can teach and do other things that I want to do and lead a Bible study. And I was like, if you pay me, that's just going to be out of my tithe. So I was a person before that would have been like, yes, more money. But then I realized, no, I serve a purpose in the kingdom where I have a career that gives me the freedoms that I can serve, and I don't have to be defined as a pastor. I'm called lay pastor. Such a lame name. I'm a lay pastor. Am I really even a pastor? I don't even have that title, right? But does that mean I'm not doing pastoring? So I've wrestled with that too. Should I go get a master's so I can tell people I'm a pastor? Do I get on staff at the church so I can tell people I'm a pastor? Or is what I'm doing already significant and part of God's work? And is it cool that I get to be in a very secular feeling industry of sales? It's all about production and results, and be studying inductive Bible study and diving into God's Word. So it's not a quick version of it, but it's a journey. And there's a lot more to that I could share. But my plan is known and seen and tested. The world has it. God's plan is unknown. It requires faith, right? What race, again, what path are we on? What race are we running? Hebrews 12 talks about like cast off every burden, run the race to win the prize. But there's a couple scriptures that I want to spend the rest of our time with and just kind of dissect, because I think they're common scriptures, but there's a lot more to them than we usually read. But really, we're not all called to be missionaries, like my story, but we're all called to live a life on mission. And if you actually look at what missionaries do, the more I've gotten to know missionaries and supported different missionaries, it's like, and we'll talk more about this next week, but they can only function if I function, right? There's no way that, a family of 4 trying to raise kids in San Diego can have an impact on India. They can't physically do that. But they can save to where they can give and support a missionary who, living in India, has no way to provide for themselves. And again, God creates a church like that. And that's a simple way to look at it with money and missionaries and stuff, but there's a lot of ways we support each other. And as a missionary, having friends that I knew back home that were a part of my life was a significant way that I was able to do what I did, because it's taxing. So, Proverbs 16:25. There's a way that seems right to a man, but in the end is the way of death. This is the thing that I hope you guys see as we've talked about different examples. There's a path that seems right to me. I want to define good and evil for myself. I want to decide my plan and my mission and my vision, and God bless me in this plan. Oftentimes, you'll see that leads to death. No wonder there's so many suicides amongst the rich and famous. Hopefully you see that's not working. Go on YouTube and type, what were that video series? There was like a Truth About Money video series where they interviewed really rich people and they said all the things they hated about being rich. But there's a fascinating piece. So if you look at Mark chapter 8, verses 34 and 36, this is a very common thing. It's also mirrored in Matthew chapter 16. But verse 34 says, "When he called the people to himself with his disciples also, he said to them, 'Whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me.'" Again, this is what we're talking about here, the path of follow me, God, or follow God's plan for me, right? This is Jesus. Where we ever hear that, take up your cross, follow me. "For whoever desires to save his own life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" There's a lot of depth in just those 3 verses. Deny himself. Pick up his cross, a symbol of death and sacrifice. Follow me. If you desire to save your life, you will lose it. If you lose your life, you will save it. It's not literally, let's go be martyrs, but we're losing the life we thought we needed and wanted. But what's fascinating about this is Mark, 16 chapters, this is chapter 8. If you ever studied Mark in detail, there's a significant thing that happens in this chapter. So if you go right before what Jesus said right here, immediately before is this thing about, "Get behind me, Satan." Immediately before that is when it's first stated that Jesus is Christ. Every other thing, if you look at Mark specifically, all before that, the disciples who spent all their time with him, and Mark is specifically Jesus' ministry. It doesn't talk about his childhood. It's like starting in his ministry. So he's with his disciples all this time. They're seeing these miracles, and they keep going, "Who is this man? How did he," like 8 chapters, the disciples spending day in, day out are like, they never got it, right? They could have known the prophecies. They could have been waiting for the Messiah. Every Israelite was waiting for the Messiah. And they're spending day in, day out with Jesus. And throughout the first 8 chapters, they're going, "Who the heck is this guy? How's he healing people?" And then he asks, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." Win for Peter. I like that. Go, Peter. Immediately afterwards, Peter has this great win, and he's the first one to say that I'm a Messiah. And obviously he says, "Hey, don't tell anyone," which is interesting. Then Jesus starts talking about what he's going to do. So they've now found out, okay, they figured out he's the Messiah. So he starts explaining, "I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and I'm going to get killed, and I'm going to die." And Peter says, "No, Lord, don't go." And Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," which is a really hyperbolic thing to say. Not literally that Peter was Satan, but Peter is going against God's mission for Jesus. He's in conflict with God. That's demonic. It's against the Lord. He's telling Jesus, don't accomplish your mission. His own friendship and desire to be with Jesus was in conflict to the very reason Jesus came to earth. So if we look at this chapter here, we finally hear Jesus Messiah. We hear this total utter failure immediately after by Peter. Where it's so off that it's just like, "Get behind me, Satan, because you're contrary to my mission." And from that context is where we get these verses. He called the people to himself, right? So again, the context is Jesus is going to die. And even though Peter sees he's the Messiah, based on Peter's humanly perspective, he's like, no, don't die. Don't do it, Jesus. Stay with us. And now he says, this is what you have to do. Deny yourself. Right? Looking at his example of what just happened. Pick up your cross. Follow me. If you want to save your life, you'll lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake and the gospel's, you'll save it. And what does it profit a man to gain the whole world if he loses his soul?
They've already spent like 3 years
Oh yeah,
with him. They,
not
they
3.
left their
Yep.
life behind already. They've already lost their life.
Yep.
So what more do they have to lose at this point?
Yeah, again, good point, Chris, right? They've already lost a lot. But again, in that culture, following a rabbi was an honorable thing to be invited to do that. So from our context, leaving a business to go follow some rogue teacher might seem like craziness. But without getting into the weeds of it, yes, and even though Peter just said he was the Messiah, he clearly did not get what it meant to be the Messiah. And Jesus is, from that very statement, saying, follow me. And again, it's saying, if you read it, he called the people to himself with his disciples also. So again, this is a bigger crowd than just purely the 12. So again, following me does not mean leave everything. Not necessarily. For some of us, it's important. But follow me means, who is the director of your life? Do I ask first and then act? Or do I act and then ask for blessing? Again, God's plan does not make sense from the human perspective. Some other scriptures. Let's go to Isaiah 55. There is a classic, God's ways are not our ways, right? This comes from Isaiah. I'm going to read 9 verses, so we get these all together, but it's Isaiah 55, 1 through 9. There's a lot of just one verse wonders here, nice little fun lyrics that you will have heard, and I love when you read it together and you're like, oh, that's all in one passage? Come all who are thirsty, come to the waters. You who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? Listen to me, and eat what is good, and you will delight in the riches of fare. Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David. See, I have made him a witness to the people, a ruler and commander of the peoples. Surely you will summon nations you know not, and nations you do not know will come running to you because of the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel. For he has endowed you with splendor. Seek the Lord while you may be found, while he may be found. Call on him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake their ways, and the unrighteous their thoughts. Let them turn to the Lord, and he will have mercy on them, and to our God, and for he will freely pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. This whole idea of coming, you're thirsty, come to the waters. If you have no money, come buy and eat. Right? This is what we talked about a little bit last week. You can have a house but not feel at home. Right? You could be homeless and feel safe and secure. Right? Again, God's economy is different. His ways are not our ways. As high as the heavens are above the earth, so are his ways above our ways. Another section, one of my favorites, 1 Corinthians 1, 18 through 31. This is a fun one, y'all. For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, and he's quoting Isaiah 29 here, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the intelligence of the intelligent I will frustrate. Where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Again, the preaching of the gospel seems like foolishness. That's what he's talking about here. The Jews demand a sign, and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. Literally preach the Creator God is killed on a cross. A stumbling block for Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom. The weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Now this becomes a little bit more personal. Brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things, the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God, that is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts boast in the Lord. And when you get to the second letter of Paul to the Corinthians, I just love this first one about we often are the foolish ones that he's going to use to shame the wise. In the world, it's about how can I forward my skills, marketable skills, to build my career. And God's going to raise us up if he needs to raise us up. He's going to tear us down if he needs to tear us down. That's a different perspective. The hustle, the grind, that's my strength, trying to win my glory. And if I have faith that God's going to put me where he wants to put me to impact the people that he wants me to impact, different paradigm. 2 Corinthians 12, 9 and 10. He just talks about having this thorn in his side. We heard that from Paul before. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. And that's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. We talked about this class being abundantly gifted, right? Now you can see in God's economy, in God's ways that are not our ways, we all can be abundantly gifted. Because, hey, if you're weak, that's more room for God's strength. There's more opportunity for God to use you in a way that blows others away. Where is it? I have it. Acts chapter 4. Where is that verse? I put it somewhere. Yes, 4 verse 13. So Peter and John heal someone, and then they're in front of these leaders, and they're asked to talk, and they speak, and it's basically verse 13 is kind of where it all comes together. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, they perceived it. What's that mean? They could tell just by looking at them. These guys aren't educated, trained men. They marveled. And they realized they had been with Jesus. That's our opportunity, right? Do I work from my strength, or do I work from God's strength? Because in God's economy, in his ways, weakness is a great thing. In our ways, it's not. And I do want to go back briefly. I had read that Ephesians 10, or 2 verse 10 before. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, prepared beforehand. But if you read that whole section in Ephesians, before that verse, I find it very fascinating. So if you start at verse 2, it says, "And you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you walked according to the course of this world." We've got these paths. We once were dead. We were incapable. We were totally gone. We used to walk in that way. According to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh. We all once did that, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love, which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, even when we were enemies of his, right? Even before we were saved, he loved us, right? Even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up together, and made us sit together in the heavenly places with Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he may show the exceeding riches of his grace and his kindness towards us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest no one should boast. For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus, for good works, which God has prepared beforehand. Again, sometimes we focus on what we were saved from, and the death and destruction and the wrath. But God did that for a purpose. He wants to use us to build his kingdom, right? By the riches of his mercy. We're going to be symbols to others. If God could save that person, he can save me. No matter how far you've fallen, it doesn't matter in God's world. That's a better story, right? So hopefully these verses and these passages, and I could go on forever here, are helping paint this picture of there's these choices. It's not about what job you do, about if you're working for a church or if you launch a ministry or nonprofit. You literally could keep on doing the exact same thing you're doing now. But it's a daily call to pick up our cross, to live as living sacrifices. Am I going to pursue my desires for me and try to fit God into my plan? Or am I going to be humble and ask first and act later? One of my favorite little verses, Matthew 11, 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I'm gentle and lowly of heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. We're out there trying to build our own kingdoms, thinking that our existence, our meaning and purpose rests on our shoulders, and that's a heavy burden. And if you think of what it means to carry a yoke, right? It is a tool that harnesses an animal's potential and uses it for work. Pull a plow. Right? If you're coming under Jesus' yoke, a lot of people will talk about, hey, if it was a 2-animal yoke, we're coming under his. Jesus is pulling alongside us. What's fascinating about this concept of coming under a yoke is I can't come under Jesus' yoke and be like, hey, I was plowing that field over there. That's my mission for my life. Can we move over there, Jesus? We would have to come out from under that yoke and go under our own yoke to try to do our own mission to build our own kingdom. So part of the easy yoke is looking through a different lens, not working for our earthly, worldly kingdom, but being soldiers in God's army, under his authority, subject to his kingdom. So that's our challenge. We can go into the world and continue to be purveyors of death and destruction. Seek my best interest at the cost of others. If you remember that quote from class 1 about anything we worship that's not God will eat us alive. And I saw a fascinating story. The last thing I'll share. I stumbled on this YouTube video as I was distracting myself when I was supposed to be focused on this last night. But there's this fascinating thing that the UN is doing in Africa that they're calling the Great Green Wall. And the Sahara Desert, if you look at the continent of Africa, you have the Sahara, and then there's another desert, and then there's like these plains, the Serengeti, and then the savanna, and then you have the rainforests. But the Sahara Desert is expanding, and they're trying to grow a wall of trees across all of Africa. And it's fascinating. You take places like this, concrete, hard dirt, can't grow a thing there. And they're teaching people using ancient techniques. They make these little half-moon circle things. And what these do is when the rain comes, instead of the rain dissipating, it collects and allows you to use the natural water to grow plants. And you can see some aerial shots of what it used to be, and they're actually bringing it back to life and turning it green. Here's just a little bit closer up of like now they're creating, and there's different steps to this, and the video goes into the process of literally turning this into a forest. That is the human potential that we have to be partakers in God's kingdom. And it's a very visual way, right? That the very same people that have dropped nuclear weapons on each other and caused mass destruction and have overfished and factory farmed and all the things that we do wrong in the world, those very same people can take a desert and turn it into a green forest. Just using the beautiful gifts of engineering that God's given us. And again, that's part of our choice in our world, right? We can choose to be the types of people that for my own best interests in this vaporous life that I'm going to die and take none of it with me, I can fight and stress and try to tear others down so I can climb that corporate ladder and cause death and destruction, not only in my soul, but in the souls of the people around me. Or I can choose to say, hey, this isn't the point. That's not the goal of my life. I have a different king. I have a different purpose. And it's going to look weird. It's going to seem radical, right? And it's not going to make sense that God's going to tell you to give this money away when it doesn't seem like you have enough. But if he's the giver of all gifts, if he's the one that put those desires in your heart to heal others and to help women, and whatever those desires are, and we're off pursuing this other thing that we think is going to fulfill us, and we're leaving behind these opportunities of hurting people that need our specific design to heal, right? We're creating these deserts when we could be turning them into forests. So I know that may not have given you more insight into what job you need to be doing with your life, but hopefully it allows you to shift your posture about your daily rituals of, am I choosing to act within my own wisdom to choose a way that seems wise to man, but in the end leads to death? Or am I going to seek a way that doesn't seem like my way, that's higher than my way, It's a little bit confusing. It's an upside-down economy that doesn't seem to add up at the end of the day. But trust that if this is what God is calling me to do, that He is the giver of the gift and He's going to provide. So, get excited about your treasure next week. I will send out, one thing I forgot was what's the scripture I wanted for treasure? Let me see here. Well,
Probably the one about like why store up treasures on earth.
I do have that one.
Probably the one.
I don't have it on my PowerPoint. I'm just looking at my notes for next week. And let's see. There was another one I had here. You might have noticed I've tried not to use the go-to scriptures, but I might end up using that one because I have it. Yeah. Matthew 6, 19 through 21. Thank you, Chris. Yeah. But what I would challenge you to do in this one specifically is read the whole chapter of Matthew 6. Anyone know Matthew 6:33? Do you know Matthew 6:33? Seek first. Yeah, it's just a few verses after this, right? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth or rust destroys and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Matthew 6, 19 through 21. That is the meditation, but more the whole chapter, which has a large title, Do Not Worry, above it, which I think is very apt when we seek to talk about treasure. And when you know what the primary marital conflicts come from, right? Money.